Hi everybody and welcome back to Module 5, Lecture 2. We are talking about writing the review. It's amazing to me because I just keep reducing the number of pages that each lecture covers because there's so much in like these, like 6 pages or 7, 8 pages, I guess. But it's a lot. So this is probably a pretty long lecture, so apologies in advance, but I got to get through it. So our topic is a familiar friend. I thought this was a great way to describe how close we become to our subject. We can't write what we don't know. So the way that we have to know all this information before we begin writing is very very intimate. We just know everything about it, every place where all this information comes, and now it's time to kind of pull it all together. As we're writing, though, we are, again, the argument of discovery, which is the beginning part of the writing, is as an outside observer. We are unbiased. We're reporting on the subject. And I bring this up a little bit later in the lecture as well, but when you think about like the idea of a lawyer that's beginning a case, or a reporter that's just been dropped into some foreign country and needs to cover some story that they basically have a high level idea of what it is, and because all of these individuals need to come to the truth. They look at things in an unbiased way from the beginning. They have to make sure they understand everything before they can build their argument, before they can tell their story, because they want it to be legitimate and significant. And so they kind of step back and begin by observing and trying to understand everything around the story. And that is what we are doing as well with our research. We are diving in, we are learning everything, we are looking everywhere, we're talking to everyone, so that we get the best picture of what we are trying to do. One of the best ways to begin is with an outline, and the purpose of the outline is a way for us to integrate and transform ideas, sequencing things. So we develop a general plan for composition. We move from a cursory understanding to an intimate personal understanding of the subject by laying things out one after another. And we're transforming, from the observer, where we're looking at everything, to the writer. We're taking on what came before in the literature. So we're looking historically at everything there is to say about our topic, different ideas and threads and patterns that we see in the literature. We then proceed to what is currently going on, more up to date, because we want to understand kind of how the topic, how the subject has changed over time, if anything has changed over time. In my case, because I was writing about technology, of course things change dramatically over time. And then we want to be able to say, as part of our paper, what logically comes next. So based on everything I know from the past, from what's currently going on, what do I really think is going to happen here? And what do I believe I want to study? I want to impart this knowledge on you. It needs to be well organized, cohesive, and a complete body of knowledge. And the outline, of course, provides a roadmap for writing. This was a really good checklist that was in the book, that really kind of gives you some points before you begin writing, because as you put the outline together, the more time you put into an outline, laying things out, the easier it is, of course, to write the draft. So does the outline flow from one main idea to the next in a reasonable fashion? Does it thoroughly capture all the contents of everything that you wanted to capture? Are the claims supported by strong evidence? Are all the conclusions warranted? So we've talked about all these things in past lectures. We'll go into them a little bit more as we go into the different elements of the review. But of course, we always need to have, good literature, strong evidence, and everything warranted so that we can make that therefore statement. Here's everything I know. Here's what's current. Therefore, this is what I think is worth looking into. Do the thesis points flow logically from one to the next? Does the outline represent an integrated whole picture? So again, we have this picture in our head of what we want to say, what we think is the next step, and we need to make sure we are writing that picture, completely. And have we omitted all the incorrect or repetitious items? We rework the outline until all the answers are yes. Again, it's easier to do an outline because, there's not a bunch of words that you have to move around. Instead, we've got these topics that we can slide up and down. We can add into them before we start all the writing. It's much easier to have everything, organized so that, as you begin writing, you're just flowing from one topic, one premise, one piece of evidence to the next. And it's easier to just continue writing. One of the hardest things is when you start writing, you start reading, and you realize that you've left out something major. Like I don't really think I can go from this point here to this point there. All of a sudden, as you write it, that therefore becomes a little bit like weaker, and you want to try to avoid that because now we're interrupting the flow of the writing and going back to start our research again, right? There's something missing. The outline helps us to prevent that, because as you read through your outline, you start the writing process in your head. Okay, this point, and then I'm going to say this, and this comes next. And okay, here's the evidence for this. These are my premises. Here's the information I need over here. All of these things help us to pull all this together before we actually start the writing process. The parts of literature review, so the book does a really good job. There's actually a slide in the very back that is a really great reference slide as you're starting to write it. Where does all this information come? But the basic parts of the literature review are the introduction, the body of the literature review, and the summation. And we're going to go through each of those individually. So the introduction, this is a very busy slide, but I thought it would be helpful to have everything on one slide. The opening, you are drawing the reader into the work, the hook. A lot of times the opening of the introduction starts with something that's in current writing. So it might be in a magazine versus, a piece of literature, an article, or a journal article or something like that. When I was writing at the time, I think one of my opening was an article from Forbes, might have been from Harvard Business Review. I've got it up here. I'm just kind of looking. But it was all about how software as a service was becoming something people were talking about, and businesses, starting to invest, and, it was supposed to be a huge growing area. All these companies were going to make a ton of money. So it was like all of this hype around it. What do we really know about how this might impact business? So oftentimes the opening is not in, a journal article. It's something interesting and current that gets people hooked into reading. The study topic, the next section, is a concise statement identifying the key ideas of the research. So the focus and perspective, the key ideas, this is going to be 2 to 3 paragraphs. So kind of where did we come up with this idea? What were we thinking? And then the context, the setting, how the research problem came to be. So the circumstances that surrounded or created the problem, So academic debates or concerns. This was where, so in my, the setting, this is where the Bharadwaj Che articles came in. So if you can find, a set of articles that talk about your topic over a really good period of time where you found that academic conversation, this is a great place to put it. Because this is the circumstances that create the problem, right? Because within that problem, I was able to see that there wasn't enough definition of the resources in an organization to say that these off-the-shelf tools that Che talked about were really making a difference, because they were too generic. There was this, kind of bucket of things that they talked about. And this created that gap that I was able to explore. So, how did the research problem come to be? This is the setting piece. This is the context. And then the significance, the justification for the study. So is it the writer's personal interest, documentation to justify the study's value to the academic community, the importance of solving or clarifying a practical problem? So for me, it was, one, it was actually a little bit of all of those, but more so it was my personal interest based on my background, what I had done, and the importance of solving or clarifying a practical problem. So to me, it was helping businesses to understand the significance of these off-the-shelf tools and software as a service and cloud versus what might have been a more traditional approach to IT computing. Applications that did everything in the company, that were written by hand, and being from technology, it was one of my biases because I had sold these applications for many years, really believed in them, saw some of the disastrous IT organizations out there that, just they were just so far behind in technology. And I state that bias in my paper, that this is something that I had seen for years. So the significance, was all three, but thankfully, obviously there was a ton of literature, and I was able to justify it in an academic way as well, because there was this gap that was identified in this, 20 years of studying this type of technology integration into an organization. And then the next part is the problem statement. So the thesis question that needs to be answered by the research study. And then finally, after that, the organization section and framework for how the literature review will be presented. So you want to discuss how you're going to lay this out and how you're going to explain all these pieces. So it's a very short, a short part of the literature review, just kind of like what to expect. Oops, gotten off here. So then, after the introduction, we have the body of the literature review, the case and documents to justify the thesis. We are presenting the case for the thesis in two sections. The body has a background section, and then it has a conclusion section. And these are basically your argument of discovery and your argument of advocacy. So the background, the argument of discovery, tells the story, what we know about the topic. And the tool that we will use to develop this and to be able to put all this together in our outline is the literature survey tally matrix. So and obviously this can be done, in a spreadsheet or, on paper as it is, in the book, or it can be done easily with the tools, EndNote and Zotero, etc. They'll help you, put something like this together. So we are documenting and cataloging the claim statements, the supporting evidence, the suitable citations, warrant justification, and then we're building, and all of this goes into building the argument of discovery, which is the profile for your storyline. So, the background, again, we go over and over this, the whole argument of discovery in this background, which sets up our argument of advocacy, which is our conclusion. So the body of the background, the background of the body, this is like part 2 of it. The information in the literature survey tally matrix provides the data to build that argument of discovery, as I just said. The details of what we have learned. And the major parts of the reasoning pattern become the headline, the headings and subheadings of this section of the literature review. So you remember when we were building these claims, where these authors with this statement create this premise, this author with this statement, these become your subheadings. So in my case, it was, the advantages of software as a service, agility, and pay-as-you-go, etc. Those all became those subheadings. There's like a paragraph on each one of this. So this is a very long section of your literature review. And you're using your reasoning. So I just, typed this out as a reminder. So we've got the one-on-one reasoning, side-by-side chain, joint, divergent, and comparative reasoning. So somewhere along the lines, of course, you chose which one you were going to use. And this is where it comes back. And all of these different elements of these claims become your subheadings that you're going to talk about individually. And you're going to create, the main portion of your literature review. That is the background. So it's, in my case, it was like 15 or so pages. For this class, it's probably, it's still probably around that, because, you're going to be writing, 25 pages. 25 references. He was thinking somewhere between, I think, 30 and 40 pages for the actual lit review. So it's a big part of the literature review itself. And, the more you're able to keep yourself organized using, the literature survey tally matrix, the better off you're going to be, because all of your information is in one area, and you've got all the detail that you need for each one of these things to help you to, move through the process of writing. Your main ideas, your the data quality. I know that in my paper, I over and over again cited, where this was published. So it was MIS Quarterly, Information and Management, because these words, these titles, help the readers understand that this information is coming from a very credible resource. So it's warranting our claims. It is giving us credibility to make the statement that we're going to make regarding the advocacy argument. And then the conclusion of the body is where we move from the argument of discovery. We've got our claims, authors, evidence, etc., to the argument of advocacy. And this graphic shows how we move from the complex claims to the body of evidence, to the warrant, to the thesis, because we are going through the argument of advocacy, saying what can we conclude from all of this information. And here is where we're using our implicative logic pattern. That was the cause and effect, effect to cause, sign, sample to population. So there's 9 different patterns, and you chose that. And this is where it goes. In the conclusion, based on everything we know, here's how we put it together, based on, the sample to population, et cetera, we're able to make this thesis claim. And those are all on page 115 if you need to review back at this point. In my case, my conclusion was there was not enough detail, this was the gap, in the corporate resources described in the literature to determine if off-the-shelf technology, and specifically software as a service, where I'm not even sure if software as a service was mentioned, but one of the things I talk about in the background was that cloud and software as a service were used interchangeably. They would use the word cloud, but they would talk about an application that was actually software as a service. So in the literature, they were used interchangeably. And so again, that was another kind of like, we're not really sure because they don't say it specifically, but they're alluding to it based on the way that they're talking about it. So there were these gaps that were just these, just not enough detail in the resources that were used to substantiate that companies didn't need to do their own application development anymore. At least, not a lot of it. There's lots of, enterprise resource planning, accounting packages. You've got Salesforce for, sales tools and lots of human resource tools. All these things that were actually hard coded by IT organizations years ago are now available just off the shelf and so much easier, best of breed, best practices, et cetera, et cetera. But there was just not enough detail. So that was the gap. And so this is, basically my thesis is, if we can get to more detail in the literature, specifically with software as a service as a foundation, can we substantiate that companies are better off using these off-the-shelf tools? So that is what we want to get to in the conclusion. Our conclusion is basically what we want to add to the conversation. So the summation, so this was the body of the conclusion, and now we have the summation, which is the last part. So again, we're stating the thesis statement, the thesis, the analysis that is associated with it, and the study's implications. So we want a detailed interpretation and explanation here. So we have key ideas, further definition, and then the impact of the thesis on practical everyday issue or an academic question. So if we're doing this strictly from an academic perspective, what academic question are we filling in here? What gap are we closing? What are we adding here? In our case, with the GEP program, we are adding the practical everyday issue to it. Because a lot of us, because we come from the business world, we are trying to make an impact on business. And from an engineering perspective, we are trying to change something that is currently out there that we can make a difference in, and improve it. So this is I think this is the last slide in the book. So the literature review outline. So this is really a nice little reference. So this is page 146. So where do all these things come from, and how can we use everything we've put together? This kind of just gives you a little aid in using everything you've put together to create all of these different sections. So a lot of it, of course, is the literature survey tally matrix. You see the mapping schemes, reasoning patterns. That's what is going into these sections. So it kind of helps us to reorient. If we have some questions as we're writing these different sections, we can go back to these individual chapters to help reorient ourselves to, what we're trying to get to and what are the specific details that are required for each one of them. So I thought this was a really good graphic and very helpful in helping us, just kind of get through where we are. And that's it. So we'll come back for the third lecture. Hopefully there's only 3. There's quite a few pages in the last one, so I'm hoping we get it in 3.